we're thinking about employment options for people with catastrophic injury, and we've been thinking about it for some time. And I just wanted to reflect a little bit on what brought us to this study. And I did some research in the sort of mid-90s, and we did a longitudinal tracking of people who had had spinal cord injury at that time. And we had some pretty amazing employment figures that we haven't seen recorded anywhere else, internationally or in Australia, at that time or since. And it started us asking, why had that happened? So back in the mid-90s, about 83% of people who were having spinal cord injuries, when they had an injury, were actually employed at the time of injury. But when they left the hospital, about 14% were employed, so when they were discharged. They were mostly people who were self-employed and had their own business, so they had something to return to. Many of them had sort of managed their business from the hospital bed, that 14%. About 6 months post-discharge, about 41% had returned either to part-time or full-time work, and in 12 months, about 52%. Now, that's somewhat of an unusual finding and quite high, and we suspect that that hasn't been maintained. We don't have any baseline data, we don't have anything to compare that to, but we're fairly confident to say that that's not the situation today. In fact, any of the employment figures that you look at would be more down around about 30%, maybe several years post-discharge, certainly not 12 months post-discharge. So the work that Greg Murphy, for example, has done in Victoria, they would be the sort of figures that he's been finding. We were just thinking, why? Why had that happened and what had changed? And I hypothesise, if you want to talk in research language, I suspect that it was something that was happening within the spinal injuries unit in Queensland at that time. We were a small unit, and the services within the hospital were probably not as specialised and as fragmented as they are today. For example, when a person had an injury and they were loaded into a helicopter and unloaded at the helipad in the centre of PA Hospital and trundled across to accident and emergency would ring the spinal injuries unit, and the medical officer on the day would run down to see them. Usually as he ran past my office, the social work office, he would say, "We've got a new patient, can you come down with me?" And I would go to A&E. We didn't have an A&E social worker at that time. So in accident and emergency, there we would be. The family would be there. If the accident had happened at work, the employer had often followed the ambulance in. The employer was often present. So the doctor would be doing the examination, and I'd be in the relatives' waiting room with the family or the employer. And, they would be wringing their hands and going, "Oh, well, this is terrible, life's over." And I'd be going, "No, hang on. There are options. There are things. The employer, you've invested a lot of training in this person. Let's think about it." And so we would start to plant those seeds there in accident and emergency. There wasn't a dedicated social worker or spinal specialist in intensive care. So when they transferred from accident and emergency to intensive care, I followed them usually, or the other social workers. It wasn't just me, there were 2 or 3 of us. And so, we would continue informally that type of conversation. None of us were vocationally trained. It was something that we just sort of did intuitively. But I suspect that it contributed to the outcomes we were seeing at that time. However, our services have become increasingly specialised and therefore more fragmented, and we don't have much of that continuity now that happens. And that's not necessarily, I'm not criticising the services, because the quality of the care has improved over that time, but we lost something, I think, in the transition during that time. We've been reflecting and thinking, and I was very much involved with the establishment of the special interest group for vocational rehabilitation counsellors within the Australian New Zealand Spinal Cord Injury Society, and I had a lot to do with Aaron Pearman, who set up Kaleidoscope, which was a specialist employment service for people with spinal cord injury in New South Wales. And I think Aaron, almost intuitively, the same way that we had developed the services in Queensland informally, knew that if you could get in early, you could change the picture. And so Aaron developed Kaleidoscope. He developed this early intervention model in New Zealand, which has produced some pretty amazing results. And other services have now continued to model. However, there's been very little research around that. So we began to think, what could we do and how could we make this different? We've been looking at the other research and the services that are around. And so you can see here that the Kaleidoscope model, they increased their employment outcomes from 13% to 41%. They reported those figures in 2008. So we've been looking at Kaleidoscope for some time and thinking, what would that look like, perhaps? And this is really more our conceptual thinking, but I'm going to hand over to Vanette, who's really the vocational rehab specialist, to talk about services.
Thank you, Pat. So, I guess one of the questions is why focus on employment? Why should that be a key driver? And I think it's quite clear we know now that employment is well recognised as contributing to overall health, particularly mental health and wellbeing, including improvements in quality of life and standards of living. From a governmental perspective, employment is important in reducing dependence on income support payments. And there has been an increasing focus on disability employment through such things as the Disability Employment Task Force by the Department of Social Services. What is the current situation? Australia is performing quite poorly in terms of employment rates for people with disability. The OECD ranks Australia as having the 21st lowest employment rate for people with disabilities out of the 29 countries rated. If you look at rates of employment following spinal cord injury internationally, Australia is far less than impressive. The return to work rate in a 2008 Queensland study was found to be 29%, compared with almost 64% in Switzerland and 57% in Malaysia. So we have some work to do. So the current status quo is that current approaches are to restore functioning to optimal levels before the consideration of vocational options and return to work. In other words, after a person's acute medical situation stabilises, VOC rehab is not integrated in any significant way in the primary rehab phase. Those covered by insurance schemes such as CTP or workers' compensation can access vocational rehab services later, and those not covered by insurance schemes can access disability employment services. But this happens quite some time after the transitioning to outpatient care. While of course physical rehab, independence in activities of daily living and psychosocial adjustment are all important rehab goals, we propose that vocational rehab can contribute to a person's successful outcomes when actioned alongside those other pursuits, not just as an add-on years later. My personal experience as a rehab counsellor in that tertiary rehab phase is that clients following catastrophic injury, and we are talking, quite some time after the injury, had not really had opportunities to have those conversations earlier. So it was as if we were planting the seed of thought around return to work, really quite late. And had that seed been planted earlier, we may not have had the resistance and difficulty engaging the client and seeing that optimism and expectation around return to work. So when all else fails, we find out what the consumers think. In a UK study, the consumers with spinal cord injury really did feel ready. Their findings show that people felt ready to discuss employment during their initial hospital admission, suggesting we may be leaving it a little late. A Swedish study of young adults aged 20 to 34 felt ready and able to work but needed some guidance in terms of vocational decision making and in accessing employment and training opportunities. In the New Zealand study, return to work was regarded as an effective treatment goal, and it really did enhance motivation and hope, which contributed to the other treatment goals as well. In a recent Australian study, those early conversations around return to work really helped to convey that going back to work is not unrealistic. It is in fact a likely outcome. So the benefits of early intervention in vocational rehabilitation are now well supported. It is clearly associated with reduced length of absence from the workforce. This reduced latency between injury and return to work is in turn a predictor of job retention and aids in protecting people from the significant financial burden that often comes with spinal cord injury. The Kaleidoscope program in New Zealand, as Pat touched upon, has shown some significant increases in employment rates. It was the Kaleidoscope program that helped inform the INVOC program that's currently running in New South Wales. Their early findings are promising, and their recent publication has shown an employment rate of 34.5%, 7% of which are people on sick leave from their employer. So really, while they're promising, I actually think we can do better, I think, and possibly harnessing some of that New South Wales versus Queensland competition might be useful. I think, and even the Australia versus New Zealand competition even too with the Kaleidoscope program. So I think we can do better. So the role of pre-injury employers. Research has shown that while early intervention might be a key, so is early engagement and continued fostering of support from a person's employer. So the importance of maintaining and supporting the occupational bond between the injured worker and their employer and workplace is considered crucial. There's possibly only a narrow window of opportunity in which to do this successfully. In the current approach, when an injury is not sustained at the workplace, employers are often informed by distraught relatives days after the fact. Where injuries are sustained in the workplace, there can be problems of blame and litigation to contend with. And these issues can interfere with a person's psychological bond with their workplace, their employer and their co-workers. Supportive employers have been recognised as promoting employment in this population, so we need to develop ways of fostering these supportive occupational bonds. Early vocational intervention could help preserve these relationships and maximise employer support through liaison with the employer and use of appropriate workplace supports. So we're sort of talking about a two-pronged approach, early intervention and the pre-injury employer support. The appropriate timing of vocational rehab is also highly relevant to other catastrophic injury, such as traumatic brain injury. Earlier vocational interventions have been associated with improved return to work outcomes for people with TBI. And again, the links to pre-injury employer are also important in predicting these outcomes. So the transferability of these VOC rehab principles are becoming clearer. In other words, early intervention in VOC rehab, along with engagement with the pre-injury employer where relevant, are important factors in enhancing employment outcomes following catastrophic injury. The key will be in ensuring a sensitive, person-centred approach, and we certainly need more research to help inform that person-centred approach, particularly, in quite a sensitive time to engage with people around employment. And we also need further research about the best timing for that approach.
So I guess that raises the question, where do we go from here? And as Vanette has alluded, we certainly need more research. Traditionally we have thought that people needed a significant period of time to adjust before they were ready to go back to work. And, it wouldn't have been uncommon for us to suggest in the past for someone maybe 2 to 3 years to sort of get their life in order before they started thinking about vocational options. Certainly, I think the emerging research is bringing that seriously into question, and we're now starting to think about gentle approaches, maybe as early as 4 weeks post-injury. And so, there's a whole lot of research that we could do around what that would look like and how you would devise an intervention that would be appropriate to be able to do that. Working really closely with the consumer group to ensure that it was sensitive and responsive to their needs. And then an evaluation of the effectiveness of such an intervention to establish an evidence-based intervention, to test that, and to have some robust evidence that would substantiate the interventions. And as Vanette has said, the current funding models really tend to target long-term unemployed, and we're perhaps missing the major opportunity that people then are entrenched on a disability support pension, have established an alternative lifestyle. The thought of inspiring hope and working with people really early to change that mindset. Just before we came in for the first session this morning, Ros Harrington referred to some of the work that I did early, and she asked me, she said, one of the quotes in your work said that one of the consumers said their solicitor told them that they shouldn't even think about going back to work until their settlement. Well, you know, in the 90s that was fairly common. I don't know whether it continues to happen, but certainly it was common then. And so, you know, there's that mindset and a culture that has grown up about this needing time, protecting the settlements, the litigation culture that really needs to be challenged in terms of maximising the benefit to a person. So these are just our conceptualisation of where we're thinking we'd like to go with some of this research, and we'd certainly be interested in any feedback, comments, and from other people. Thank you.